Hi, welcome to the second video in my series about AP History DBQ essays. So the tips we're going to talk about here apply to AP World, AP Euro, and APUSH, although the sample DBQ we're going to look at is specifically regarding AP World. Now you can download the sample DBQ we're going to look at from the link in the video description below. So let's move along. First of all, it's important to note that the sample DBQ we're going to look at is not a full-length standard AP exam DBQ. A standard AP exam DBQ provides 7 documents for you to analyze. The one we're going to use today is a sample training DBQ, providing only 4 documents. And basically the point of this is that it's going to give you practice with the thinking skills and the planning steps for a DBQ, but we're just going to save a little time by only dealing with 4 documents instead of 7. But everything we're talking about here applies to the longer full-length 7 document DBQ as well. So, also then, the prompt we're looking at: evaluate the extent to which Buddhism was accepted in Chinese society in the period circa 500 CE to 900 CE. As you read the documents and examine the evidence, you might find that there's nothing but evidence showing you that Buddhism was very accepted. You might find that there's nothing but evidence showing you very little acceptance. Chances are, though, you will most likely find a wide range of evidence that covers a few different possibilities. It's up to you to establish coherent arguments based on what the evidence actually shows you. So once again, you might find a lot of evidence for one particular argument, one particular piece of this range, but you'll probably find a wide range of evidence covering a lot of acceptance to very little acceptance, and you'll need to think about the reasons why this was happening and so on. Now, remember though, there are no correct or incorrect responses to the prompt, only valid and invalid interpretations of the evidence. So, when the graders sit down to read these essays, they're not going to be looking for one specific argument for everyone to make. There's no one single correct answer. As long as the argument you're making is based on a valid interpretation of the evidence in the documents, as long as it's clear that you understand what the documents are saying and showing, then your evaluation will be valid. So now, the documents themselves for this DBQ, there's 4 of them. Document 1 is by Maoza, a Confucian scholar who adopted Buddhism later in his life. This is a book called Disposing of Error, circa 500 CE. So, he was a Confucian scholar, and in this book, he presents a dialogue. The questions are meant to be criticisms or critiques of Buddhism from a Confucian perspective. And then the answers are from a Buddhist perspective, essentially defending Buddhism from these critiques and disposing of the error of Confucianism. So, this is something that generally shows a sort of willingness to defend Buddhism and essentially how to do it. Document 2 is by Han Yu, a leading Confucian scholar and official at the Tang Imperial Court. This is his Memorial on Buddhism, 819 CE. Now, anytime you see an asterisk like that, anywhere in the document, make sure you look at the bottom of the document where you see an explanatory note. So, now in this particular memorial, this letter to the emperor, this is a few hundred years after the first document written by Maoza. So Han Yu describes a situation in which some Buddhist monks are going to bring a relic from the Buddha, a finger bone of the Buddha, to the imperial palace for some ceremonies and rituals. And Han Yu's upset about this. He advises the emperor against allowing these monks to come to the palace. He says they're going to get violent and crazy, and then he criticizes Buddhism as something that's too foreign and it undermines Chinese society. So this is something showing, this particular fellow who is an elite, he's a scholar, he's an official, trying to suppress Buddhism, trying to tell the emperor to move away from Buddhism. Now, document 3 is a source that is the map of religious establishments in Chang'an, the Tang Dynasty capital city, early 9th century CE. So also toward the later end of the time period within the prompt. And here you can see that all across the city, if you go full screen on your video here, you can see symbols representing different religious establishments: Buddhist, Taoist, Zoroastrian, Nestorian Christian, a type of Christianity, and then super monasteries or abbeys, like big state-supported Buddhist monasteries. And essentially across the whole city, you see a bunch of Buddhist temples and monasteries, at least as many as there are Taoist, which indicates that this is evidence that Buddhism has become widely accepted by the early 9th century in China. And then document 4 is an edict on Buddhism by the Tang Dynasty Emperor Wu, written in 845 CE. So an edict, basically just like a law put forth by the emperor himself. So in this, he also kind of agrees with the author of document 2 that Buddhism is foreign, it's not really Chinese, it undermines and weakens Chinese society, and that it should be eradicated. So this is the emperor turning against Buddhism even after it has become quite popular apparently in Chinese society. So here I've provided a table for you showing a basic breakdown of the content, the source, the main idea of each of the 4 documents in our sample DBQ. And once again, your purpose here is to look at the evidence in each document and see how it kind of fits with other documents, and then see what that evidence is showing you about the prompt. So we can see that we've got document 1 at the beginning of this time period, defending Buddhism from critiques by Confucianism, providing responses to those critiques, showing like at least this fellow is willing to defend and accept Buddhism within China. That kind of fits with document 3, that it shows that by the early 800s, Buddhism has become more popular. It has been accepted even in the Chinese capital itself and in the palace itself where there are some temples. But then documents 2 and 4 also kind of go together to fit into a big argument, that these are both showing you elites, members of the government, turning against Buddhism because it's foreign, because it's un-Chinese, because it's, has all of these weird beliefs that are against Chinese tradition and culture. So basically, as you read through the documents, you really need to think about how they can relate to other documents in the DBQ. Don't just look at documents in total isolation from each other. Now we're going to talk about arguments, or grouping the documents and evidence. So remember that any argument you make needs to have evidence supporting it. And in the case of the DBQ, the evidence is going to come mostly from the documents themselves, but you should try to bring in outside knowledge whenever you can. You only have to do it once successfully to get the point for it in the rubric, but try to think of just any details, any more things you know about the topic that can help you support or elaborate on the arguments you're making. So now remember that the groups you come up with need to be focused around some piece of evidence that shows you something you could say about the prompt. So if we're looking for the extent to which Buddhism was accepted in Chinese society, your arguments need to be focused around this idea of, like, were people accepting it or were they not accepting it, and for what reasons? So we saw a couple of documents then that showed us that many Chinese people were willing to accept and defend Buddhism. So our first argument could be that. And the evidence for it, you got document 1, Maozi defending Buddhism from critical questioning at the beginning of the time period, 500 CE. And then you got document 3, the map of Chang'an, showing the presence of Buddhist temples in the capital city, including the imperial palace. That shows you, hey, a lot of people accepted it, including the emperor at that point. But you could also bring in some outside knowledge here. You could talk about, if you know this, like how much government support there was for Buddhism at the time. You could talk about what types of Chinese people tended to gravitate toward Buddhism. Anything that could help you just elaborate more, give more detail, more support to explain that argument, to add more depth to that argument. So in this case, we could talk about Chinese merchants or peasants coming to Buddhism because it offered them, more sort of personal rights and, spiritual equality with people above them in society. For women, they could become nuns and like escape from abusive relationships, something like that. Now, we also saw then that there was another side to this situation. We saw that toward the end of the time period, in documents 2 and 4, the government and some elites within the government were turning against Buddhism because of its foreign origins. So in document 2, we got Han Yu criticizing the Buddha and Buddhist monks who were coming to the emperor's palace. In document 4, we've got the Emperor, Wu, declaring that Buddhism should be eradicated from China because it's so un-Chinese and foreign. So once again, 2 documents kind of showing you the same concept and the same sorts of evidence that you could use to support this bigger argument here. And then you could bring in some outside knowledge here too. Even though they tried to eradicate it, Buddhism still remained really popular even after the Tang Dynasty turned against it. It never really went away from China. It was always kind of there as a popular religion. If that's something you happen to know, bring it in, and you can add more depth to show like the reality of how much Buddhism had been accepted, even though some elites were turning against it. That's it for video 2 in the series. So now join me in video 3, where we're going to talk about writing the DBQ essay and how to fulfill all of the points in the rubric in order to make sure that you max out your score.